Hello and welcome to Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. I am indubitably your host, Andrew Heaton, and the program is brought to you by the Jumbo Elevator by Up Machines Unlimited, and I'll tell you why. A jumbo elevator is a unisex elevator. If you're like most Americans, your office has two sets of elevators, one for the gents and one for the ladies. Male elevators move a lot faster and have shorter lines, but female elevators are a lot cleaner, and women can go in together and nobody thinks it's weird. The reason for that is, of course, because we live in the Me Too era. I sure don't want to smoosh myself into an elevator full of female colleagues. No, sir, not one of those tiny elevators where you don't have any room. There you are, pressed up against a bunch of lady coworkers, so tight you can barely drop a $50. In that kind of packed environment, a female coworker might honestly mistake fumbling around for your pocket for car keys as something untowards. And now HR has to get involved and you get fired, and pretty soon you're in a sleeping bag beneath an overpass drinking liquor out of a plastic jug. But a jumbo elevator fixes all that. There's plenty of space for the men and the women in your office, quite possibly for everyone in your building. Jumbo triple-deck elevators transport up to 480 people, affording more than enough room for everyone to do jumping jacks, shadow box, and not accidentally grope each other, so that you can finally brick up those old male and female elevator shafts and go from floor to floor in a luxurious unisex elevator. Jumbo elevators from Up Machines Unlimited. Breathing room for the upwardly mobile. And now it's time for Heaton Reviews, where I rank things along arbitrary lines that pertain directly to me. Today, fictional presidents of the United States, according to who I would most want to give the eulogy at my funeral. Number 6, Frank Underwood from House of Cards. Now, I know there's been a lot of scandal around Kevin Spacey of late, so let me assure you, Kevin Spacey is absolutely invited to speak at my real-life funeral. Great guy. I don't believe those allegations at all. I just think Frank Underwood, the fake president, would give a pretty boilerplate speech, to be honest with you, which is why I put him at number 6. Number 5, Jack Nicholson from Mars Attacks. President Jack Nicholson would be great because there would be a sinister, smoldering element to him that would make everyone at the funeral think he either killed me or alternately helped me fake my own death. Either way, my funeral would end with one big neon question mark. Number 4, President Dwayne Elizondo Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho. This guy would be a ton of fun. Ton of fun. Remember the scene in Idiocracy where he fires a gun into the air during a State of the Union address? I've never been to a pro wrestling funeral, but I have to think it's at least twice as entertaining as a Lutheran funeral. That said, my funeral is about me, and I think President Camacho would make it all about him. That's why he's only number 4. Number 3, Gerald Ford. I just don't see this guy giving a very rousing speech. Tasteful? Yes. Memorable? Hardly. The only fun part would be when he accidentally tumbles into the open grave. Everybody has a good laugh. But is that really how I want to cap off my funeral? Slapstick? No, thank you. Number 2, Kevin Kline from Dave. This would be a tear-jerker. My life eulogized by a heartfelt everyman delicately wearing the mantle of the presidency? Unlike showboater Dwayne Elizondo Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho, Kevin Kline would make my funeral about everyone else so that my passing would be a cathartic touchstone for all present, drawing us into a touching emotional matrix. Even waiters who didn't have the chance to know me would start bawling and plopping clumps of dirt on my casket. Great speech by President Kevin Kline, or whatever the name of his character was in the great film Dave. And finally, number 1 of fictional presidents I would like to have speak at my funeral. Bill Pullman from Independence Day. The speech he gives before they go sucker punch the aliens is one of the greatest oratories in the history of mankind. Just above Queen Elizabeth's speech to the troops at Tilbury and below Pericles' funeral oration.
Good morning. In less than an hour, you will join other mourners from around the world in the largest simultaneous funeral in the history of mankind. for all us today. We can't be consumed by our petty differences anymore. We will be united in our common interests, and how sad we are that Heaton is dead, because he was such a neato guy. Perhaps it's fate that Heaton was murdered on the 4th of July by a jealous lover, who, as we all know, is 24 years old and putting her way to med school by working weekends at Hooters. He was angry, as we all know, and Heaton started dating another girl putting her way through law school by working weekends at Hooters. A very awkward weekend at Hooters, I'll tell you that much. Either way, I think we should go fight these aliens. Because we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day. And to a lesser extent, Heaton's funeral. Yes, we validate parking.
My guest today is Rob Montz. He is a filmmaker and made a terrific mini-doc recently that I really enjoyed because it was a subject near and dear to my heart. And that was the engorged, power-filled, gouty presidency. Rob, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
That has been a bugaboo of mine for a long time. I find it distasteful and weird when we sort of elevate the presidency to a kind of father of the nation, priesthood, celebrity, pope figure. And I feel like that has happened more and more over the last 50 years. And I thought your documentary was very good at being able to kind of chart the progress of bureaucrat to God King. And so kind of walk me through was there a period at which the president was just a number pusher and then we decided to make them a celebrity? Like when did it kind of shift?
Well, to make it clear, it's a thoroughly bipartisan phenomenon and bipartisan tenet of faith that the president has this transcendent role to play, not just in American politics, but in like the spiritual and existential health of the country.
Yeah.
And one of the essential points that the documentary tries to make, which again is published through We the Internet TV, and anyone can check out just by going to realityshowpresident.com, what the point it tries to make is that Trump, for all of his superficial abnormality, actually represents a grotesque inevitability given the obscene set of expectations we have steadily attached to this office over the last 100 years or so. The documentary kind of starts with the original conception of the presidency, which I think the average American would find to be almost incomprehensibly modest in what it does. And one of the core things that the founders built into the presidency is that it ultimately be a kind of a semi-anonymous office, and that most of the power is supposed to be within Congress, which is the much more politically and publicly sensitive, deliberative body. And kind of Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt did kind of chafe at the constraints of the office, but the floodgates really open when a man of kind of FDR's aristocratic charms and political strategic genius enters the office right at the point of maximum crisis for the country. Yeah. You have the kind of the dual traumas of the Depression and World War II, and the public is just thirsty. They're hungry for a savior, and FDR is more than willing to satisfy that need. And he's the guy that through his fireside chats and other means creates this direct emotional connection with the public, which serves as the nexus for this steady accrual of expectations and powers in this office. So he's really the alpha
and I'll say
this whole trend.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about, because it's a reasonably quick video, I think it's maybe 15 to 20 minutes, but you pack so much content into it. And one of the things I really enjoyed about it is that you do it chronologically, and you have like a tagline for most of the presidents from FDR going. So FDR is the father president, as opposed to, later you've got Kennedy, who's the royal president, where we look at Kennedy and we see Camelot and this sort of Kate Middleton-esque wife and, the kind of aristocratic king figure going on. Whereas with FDR, he's talking to a microphone, he's doing the fireside chats, he's our dad. The presidency's now taking on this paternal role. And I thought that was great, the way you kind of gleaned the various character attributes that were added to it. Is it cumulative? So with FDR, we've got President Dad. With Kennedy, we've got the royal president. And then we go forward. We eventually got celebrity presidents and things. Do all of these things add, or does the presidency change in flavor from president to president?
The annexation of new unconstitutional powers in the presidency is entirely a one-way ratchet. So anything that one president accrues will inevitably be passed on to his successors, which is something that's extremely important for people to take into consideration when their guy happens to be in office. That anything that he decides to swipe is going to be passed on to someone like, let's say, President Donald Trump. Right after FDR, you have Harry Truman, who, kind of keeping with that single noun descriptor, is kind of the warrior. He's the guy who breaks this very clear constitutional provision that Congress, not the president, gets to decide when America goes to war. And he does it by sending a bunch of troops to South Korea in response to a sudden invasion by North Korea. And what's most remarkable, that I go into a little bit in the doc, but you really get in when I was doing the research for it, is how casual that break was. That if you look at some of the internal documents of Truman's war team, a couple people bring up like, hey, maybe this is an explicit violation of the Constitution for us to send 20,000 troops to the peninsula. And then someone else basically saying, well, like, let's just see if we can get away with it. And we'll just call it a peace action, and we'll mention how the UN provided explicit sanction for the American troops. And that's all we need to do. And it turned out that that cynical calculation happened to be correct. They got away with it. And then the second they get away with it, they establish a new precedent that gets taken oftentimes to extreme extents by later presidents.
Yeah, because now it's you basically you declare war as president, and you don't really, because it's never legally war. I don't think we've actually had a legally declared war since maybe World War II or maybe the Korean War. I'm not sure. Most of the conflicts we've been are temporary peacekeeping exercises or whatever. We rarely actually go through the mechanism of declaring war. But with say like North Korea and things like that, you go in and now Congress sort of has 30 days or 60 days to agree to whether or not they're going to keep funding it, things like that. And they're definitely in the back seat as far as foreign policy goes, which is not the original intent.
And people, I mean, there was certainly here in Washington, D.C., which is the home for a certain kind of pro-war and neoconservative clique.
Bill Crystal.
There was an enormous, I'm not naming any names.
It's Bill Crystal. I know. We all know who you're talking about.
There was an enormous uproar when President Trump decided to unilaterally revoke American troops in Syria. Mm-hmm. But then you do have to wonder, what were our troops doing there in the first place, given that there was no explicit congressional authorization for American soldiers to be on the ground? And when Trump does that, he's demonstrating one of the risks that had been foreseen explicitly by the founders, that leaving war making up to the executive necessarily leads to a schizophrenic foreign policy, because the decisions don't have to go through the fractious and friction-filled process of congressional authorization. It can basically just be switched with the stroke of a pen by whoever happens to occupy the Oval Office.
Right, and then on top of the war powers are a huge part of that, and I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. But another element of that is executive orders. Talk about that for a minute. What are executive orders, and where do they start ballooning in terms of action in the United States?
Well, they were originally intended for just kind of minor tweaks to the federal bureaucracy, that the president, as kind of the chief administrator of the American government, could kind of very quickly make small changes. But then,
I thought they were sort of like internal. I thought that they were supposed to be internal memorandum, where it's like, okay, technically the president's the head of, like, let's say the Department of Commerce, and so he'll go, look, I know that we've got X amount of things to do, but I'm telling you to focus on these 3 or 4 things. Sort of the manager of the building, and it's gone beyond that, right?
And then the person who really ratchets them up is FDR, where you see kind of the predecessors leading up to him some of them averaged for their entire presidency, maybe 9 or 10 executive orders. And FDR, by the time he leaves office, unceremoniously, of course, is I think he's issued 3,000 to 4,000.
Wow. Okay. So
he's using executive orders in ways that they've never been wielded before to create entire new agencies out of whole cloth, just because the alpha god king FDR has decided to will them into existence. And it's become, I mean, we see it plenty today where the Obama administration was extraordinarily aggressive about using executive orders in ways that were clearly unconstitutional to basically create legislation through the stroke of the executive pen.
Yeah.
That's what the DACA amnesty was. That's also what things that are kind of lesser well known among the broader public, but that still have profound economic consequences, such as the Clean Power Plant rule. This is the presidency. The president basically. Well, let me back up just for 1 second.
Sure.
Part of the reason that executive orders have become such a powerful weapon for unilateral president action is because we've seen an enormous and rapid expansion of the federal bureaucracy and the administrative apparatus. So huge, powerful administrative agencies that are ultimately not responsive to the public because you don't get to elect people that are housed within these regulatory agencies. So as they grow in power, the president can, using executive orders, direct them to use their regulatory powers in certain ways that have the effect of legislation. And so it's actually not one of the people that actually was one of the earliest champions for the administrative state for this explicit purpose, right, was Woodrow Wilson, who was kind of one of the core precursors to FDR. It was someone he'd had grand ambitions of the God King president, but he was never able to fully realize those ambitions. Although he definitely expanded the powers of the office, he was one of the early enthusiastic champions for the administrative state, explicitly in order to counteract suffrage having been provided to black people. You can go back and you can see that he wants more and more power to be put into these unelected bodies in order to kind of offset the effects of black people being allowed to vote.
Yeah, and he didn't he have the was it Birth of a Nation, the KKK film? He played that in the White House. Like he was, if this is a fairly well documented phenomenon with Woodrow Wilson, that he wasn't friendly with other races.
Well, yeah, not a fan, and definitely that's one of the silver linings of going back into the history of the presidency is it makes it better. It helps to put today's problems in perspective and to recognize that it is funny that particularly the critics of the president, they talk about this holy and esteemed office and the way that he's sort of despoiling this grand presidential legacy as if guys, not just Richard Nixon, but guys like LBJ hadn't occupied that office. Like people that were colossal, I don't want to use colossal jerks, we'll put it that way. I mean, you go back and you read about LBJ, he's basically like a proto-Trump, but with a little bit more political savvy. And he's constantly, and I mean this literally, during negotiations with Congress, sticking his genitals in congressmen's faces. Like this is a well-established power play that he would do.
Yeah, in the Oval Office wasn't like one of the regular things he would do. Like I've read weird things about LBJ, and I try and be very clear on what's because there is this sort of odd ongoing proxy slap fight between Nixon enthusiasts and LBJ enthusiasts that I find, but I try and cut through that to the stuff that you can more or less document. And LBJ had like he'd have bowel movements and he'd leave the door open to the bathroom and make his staff talk to him because it was just this odd power move that he wanted to do to like really make them feel like they were, they were the ones receiving on the end of the power dynamic. And he like took a friend out to like look at his grave and like peed into the grave. Like it was very weird stuff going on with
the dude was feral. The dude was a feral dude. And obviously Nixon's even worse. I mean, you have stories of Nixon in the final days of the impeachment process, drunkenly stumbling around the Oval Office and talking to the portraits of the old presidents, right? These are people that have occupied the same office as President Trump.
There was a literal silent coup that happened where I think it was either the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Secretary of Defense, I can't remember which one, issued this kind of quiet internal memorandum that was like, if President Nixon calls for nuclear war, you're to belay that order and defer to me, because he was literally worried that Nixon, who was drunk and depressed, might end the world, and was not top of his game at that time.
Yeah, not exactly.
Well, so noting that then, that there have been these, and I think you're right. I think we kind of look back and we're like, oh, Woodrow Wilson, he was a university president that became president of the country. An academic in office. How great is that? And we sort of forget the odious elements of him.
Yeah, the flagrant white supremacist part of his personality.
Yeah, we forget the white supremacist part of him,
was a non-trivial attribute that he had.
Yeah.
And let me just say also, and we'll get to Obama eventually, but the kind of key chapter in the documentary, which again people can watch at realityshowpresident.com, the key bridge between JFK and Obama is Clinton, in what I call the kind of advent of the reality show presidency, which obviously is also a clear precursor to the person who currently occupies the office, where during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, you have this nihilistic media glee that relishes all the tiny little salacious tidbits of information related to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And all of it is entirely amoral and enormously cynical, but it also, because people were willing to excuse horrific behavior by the president, because according to some weird crypto-religious logic that I don't understand, he somehow was responsible for the huge economic boom this country experienced in the late 1990s. They were willing to excuse it because they thought that he was making them rich, and they were willing to excuse it because they didn't mind having a president who would just entertain them in a way that's different than the way that JFK entertained them, right? And not in an ennobling way, kind of in a more postmodern,
in a sort of TMZ
way.
Type way.
But that all entertainment is good entertainment. And the chief entertainer of the country is the president. And that in turn allowed Bill Clinton to get away with some thoroughly odious behavior in his personal life, and things that are well documented that extend beyond some oral visitations by an intern, right?
Yeah.
And you see the American public being willing to forgive all sorts of horrific behavior as long as the guy in the office is reasonably entertaining and promises to deliver the goods in the economy.
So then
right?
the extension of that, because you said that he's kind of the bridge between between Kennedy and Obama. I look at Obama and I almost see like a savior type thing going on, where people looked at Obama when he was in office as this sort of salvific character that was above it all. And so I see it less as a celebrity figure, although that's definitely there, and more as an almost quasi-religious figure. And I guess I see the same with Bush. I think Bush was kind of like, we were sort of electing a warrior chaplain to office.
Bush is much more of the Truman warrior model, particularly in the wake of 9/11. He recorded the highest presidential approval ratings figures in the history of modern political surveys.
Wow.
And that in turn allowed him to erect an enormous, clearly extrajudicial, unconstitutional surveillance apparatus. And for his lawyers to make the claim in court that the president could unilaterally throw an American citizen into a military brig and hold him there without access to counsel indefinitely. I mean, this
Which
is
we've got some constitutional provisions about that. That goes back a ways.
That's not chill.
We're kind of big about that at the beginning of the founding of the Republic.
That's not chill. That makes George Washington cry to hear things like that. But he can get away with it because, again, people were so desperate for this warrior prince. And kind of the repeated theme throughout the doc and also all the press that I've done related to it is this idea that there's something sickly within people that they are actually desperate for some alpha leader to relieve them of the burden of democratic self-government. They want someone else to make the decisions for them. They're willingly and voluntarily outsourcing their, let's say, democratic agency to get, extra pretentious on my part. And that thirst and that sickly hunger is what enables this annexation of power. And that, I think, also feeds into another essential part of this equation, which is not just having presidents that want and then successfully obtain extra constitutional powers, but it's in having a extraordinarily feckless and cowardly Congress that won't stand up for itself, right? The entire system is built upon the different branches of government jealously competing with each other and fighting to retain their constitutionally provided turf. And particularly over the last 20 years or so, over and over and over again, when presidents make unconstitutional power grabs, Congress just bows its head in subjugation in deference. And now in Congress, particularly the House, it seems like the vast majority of people that occupy their office are primarily concerned with getting cable news hits for their respective partisan channels and accruing as many retweets and likes on their Instagram photos as possible. They're also
if, on the Republican side, I think they're living in fear of Trump, which I'm not saying is an excuse for them. They need to do their job regardless of whether or not they think it's going to have electoral impact on them. But when you look at, say, like Jeff Flake or Bob Corker, that initially stood up to Trump, they were going to be primaried and so ended up bowing out. And so when you have things like recently with Trump declaring a national emergency in order to build a wall, you had a few, I'm going to say principled Republicans, so I'll give due credit to.
I think it was a dozen. It was a dozen in the Senate.
Yeah, you had about a dozen. You had your Rand Paul and your Mike Lee and several others that came around.
The libertarian
to vote on that.
crazies.
Yes, exactly.
They fear no man.
all of these kind of tub-thumping Republicans that probably would have been ranting about the expanded powers of the presidency under Obama immediately turned tail and went, well, if it's our guy, and I don't want to fight him, and have dropped that prerogative. I do want to back up slightly, though, because there's something I did want to talk to you about, and I think you identified it, and it's worth looking at, is the idea of the sort of innate desire that we have for an authoritarian figure, and that is one of the things I kind of go back on is the presidency, is it something where we're creating social constructs, we're modifying it, or is it rather that we're approaching a default state? And I think I'm more towards your view that it's sort of a default state. I think that the natural, untampered way of organizing people is to have a guy with a stick in the middle of the room that's in charge, and that authoritarian impulse. It's not like we could be democratic or we could be authoritarian. I think that democratic system that we put in place, the system of individual rights, are actually fighting against human nature, and which is why I'm bothered by the continual slide towards the president as a kind of cult figure.
I agree entirely, and not to start sounding like a Jordan Peterson fanboy, but it's a evolutionarily endowed way of creating and then placing oneself in a hierarchy. That there's something within our little lizard lobster brain that thinks that way about social organization, and that is more than enthusiastic to place ourselves in that hierarchy, even if we're in a lower, inferior position, because at least at that point there's some sense of semblance and order. That's we're desperate for it. I mean, one of the first doc that I ever made, which was through the Moving Picture Institute, which is the place that runs the Weeby Internet channel, was about the North Korean propaganda apparatus.
Yeah, I saw that. Juche Strong.
Right, and we can, but one of the essential points it was trying to make is, of course, there is violent oppression in North Korea, but just focusing on that misses another essential pillar of the Kim regime's control formula, which is crafting a very specific story that feeds into this thirst and this hunger among Homo sapiens of every ethnicity and geographical location for an alpha to tell them what to do. Yeah. And it's a very savvy, and it's also very hyper-customized to some particular strains of what might charitably be described as hardcore xenophobia that's long been a feature of Korean culture. But that just focusing on the labor camps or just focusing on the large military misses another essential element of the control apparatus. And that's always been just a fascination of mine, which is how do you make people complicit in their own subjugation? Yeah, and a lot of that is telling them the story that feeds into this really sickly, evolutionarily endowed need for a daddy to tell them how to live. And the whole point of the Democratic project is to reject that, is to say that we can do it on our own in a radically egalitarian fashion. Yeah,
I'm with you. And I look at, say, like it's interesting looking at how Americans look at the royal family in Britain. because we're just slobbering all over them. I mean, like if I go to the grocery store, there's tons of magazines that have Kate Middleton's having a baby, and it's like, why is this pertinent to us? And I think like your point about a hierarchy is salient. People are comforted by having a hierarchy, and so there's this sort of craving to have somebody at the top of a food chain that can then dispense favors and affection and attention to us. I will say I like the British system in that they've inadvertently but very cleverly they've rendered in twain the head of state and the head of government, which we've not done, and I wish we would do.
I was just about to say to you, can I like defend the British royal family?
Oh yeah, no, I'm all in favor.
Right.
I like
it as a
ceremonial
release
monarchies.
valve.
I like
exactly it. That's
I think
exactly
we need that. People have this dumb impulse to just like slobber and fawn over whoever the alpha is, as you pointed. Then absolutely, I think in the same way that America we've very smartly separated church and state. I think making a division between power and reverence is very important, and that's one of the reasons the presidency is so dangerous, is because it is both the head of state and the head of government. And you'll hear people say things like, I disagree with the president, but I respect the office. And I think that's a very bad way of thinking. I think we should view the president as the top bureaucrat. Which is to say, it's the top number cruncher, and we should feel very comfortable kicking the president around. I do not think there should be this veneer of mysticism and reverence around the presidency, because it creates too many problems, and it allows too many things to it allows too many powers to aggregate there. That even if you like the current occupant of the White House, whether it's Obama or Trump, eventually there's going to be somebody you despise that now has that expanded apparatus at their disposal.
Right, and Gene Healy actually recently came out with a kind of an essay in which he thinks part of the problem is we got too trigger shy when it came to using the veto to remove a president from office, and now that it gets tossed around not so casually by the Trump's Democratic opposition, and it seems like this monumental, profoundly undemocratic way of removing kind of the sovereign of the people. And that Healy actually goes back to the original constitutional debates about what the veto is and how it would function, and it was intended to be used much more aggressively than it is today. Mm-hmm. And it's not some extraordinarily anti-democratic move. It's supposed to be a foundational check against grotesque expansion of presidential power. That's what it's there for.
And you're saying the veto specifically, like the one that came out recently to rebuke the national emergency.
I meant impeachment.
Impeachment.
Sorry,
okay, impeachment. Yeah,
I meant impeachment. Sorry.
Which if you look at most of our friends in the British Commonwealth countries, because their head of state is unrelated to the power structure. There's the option for a vote of no confidence, which happens somewhat regularly. Where
right, and no one is looking to Theresa May to redeem the British soul. Right?
Yes.
That's not the set of pseudo-religious expectations that get attached to the top executive in government. And that's an extraordinarily healthy way to view this person.
And I think that the pseudo-religious spiritual salvation of the people through the elected leader, I agree with you in that take of that. Like, I think one of the reasons people are so worked up today, there are many reasons to dislike Donald Trump, and there are many policy reasons to dislike Donald Trump. There's plenty of reasons to not like the guy. But I think one of the things that's now beginning to happen is that when you look at these sort of debates between Republicans and Democrats, Jonah Goldberg had a great analogy where it's almost like English Catholics and Protestants from the 18th century, like vying for who sits on the throne. That the throne of England must have a Protestant at the helm, and if not, England makes no sense. And it's we're not living in an Arthurian legend. We're not in Game of Thrones. There's no concept of like who the true king should be, and that having some sort of effect on the life of the nation. It is a very religious and misplaced way of thinking, in my view.
Right, and the radical feature of liberal democracy, which is the best way of self-governance that Homo sapiens have come up with, mm-hmm. is that it's just a pure aspiritual set of processes for organizing a society. The institutions of government are not supposed to feed some deep spiritual hunger. Mm-hmm. If you want that, then you should go check out how that worked out in, Maoist China or the Soviet Union, where government is intended to provide you with some spiritual salvation. And
who better to do than an elected official and or dictator to provide you with spiritual nourishment?
and I think that obviously humans need that. I think it's extraordinarily important to build that into your life. But there's a way in which, I mean, I'm just going to be mouthing points that David Brooks has made much more eloquently than I can, that part of the cause of this steady ratcheting of spiritual and religious expectations on the president might be in part caused by the shrinking and the shriveling of these civic institutions, apolitical civic institutions that used to serve that role, right? The churches and the community groups that used to feed that, and humans just by nature need it, and if they can't find it from their church or their synagogue or their mosque, they're going to look for it and they're going to look for it in politics, and that leads to all sorts of grotesque outcomes and grotesque abuses of power. I think
you're dead on that. That is something that I think about quite a lot. Is I view politics as an exercise in problem solving. I don't view it as a opportunity for me to express my identity to the universe in some sort of cosmic sense. I don't view voting as a sacrament that bonds me to my fellow tribalists. I think that that's all hogwash. And I suspect that. I think you're right. Like I'm a fairly irreverent person, but having traveled quite a lot and living in the United States too, I do think reverence is a sort of it is an endemic feature and need for human beings. We will find something to revere, and as we have more and more of a secular society, rather than funneling that in different directions, the state is kind of taking up that gap, and political parties are becoming religious organizations. You know, protests take on a kind of almost sacramental or like a liturgical capacity to them, and it also alters the nature of discourse, because now we're not talking about how to best solve the problem. Now we're talking about what religion we want the United States to be, whether we want it to be Catholic or Protestant, and then it becomes this very heated, very angry thing.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say.
I'm saying. Let me just make the point about.
Yeah.
Can I say, because we haven't really touched on this very quickly, that analysis related to Obama, right?
Okay.
And that obviously his election was, I think, a profound racial milestone. It was an enormously big deal for a black person to occupy the Oval Office. But if you go through the literature and the media coverage, and then the campaign materials from the Obama team at the time, and then all the way through his presidency, it very clearly devolves into something much worse than that. It's much more of Obama as Messiah, Obama as the ultimate healer. And what that religious aura on the president does is it incapacitates the public's critical faculties. And as I demonstrate in the documentary, I don't want to give away too much of it because I want people to go watch it, but that enables the Obama administration to expand presidential authority in ways that would seem like sci-fi dystopian if it hadn't actually happened, right? Things that I think even the most hardcore member of the anti-Trump resistance would find quite distasteful. But the American public, at least his supporters, don't know about it. There was these abuses, and they're willing to give a pass, because again, all this whole Messiah-centric way of thinking about politics means that you just have to vote once every 4 years, and then you've done your job. You're not responsible for keeping this guy accountable.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. One of the interesting things, the conclusion of the Obama presidency was talking to my progressive friends that were far more enthusiastic about him than I was. In their view, Obama was a extremely peace-loving president because Bush is the warrior, or the warlike guy. Obama's a good guy. His heart is pure. Therefore, the military actions that we've had have been very minimal, and they've been all justified. And I looked like I just did brief cursory research on the figures. I don't have them in front of me, but I believe we dropped 26,000 bombs on 8 different countries his last year of office.
Right.
So I look at that and empirically go, that is not a peaceful presidency right there.
He was the first president where America was at war for every single year of his presidency. And again, Obama made a big deal on the campaign trail in 2007 about the executive overreach of the Bush-era security apparatus. And once he occupies the office, he not only retains that apparatus in its entirety, he adds some interesting new innovations in presidentially directed murder to it.
Yeah. And
he gets away with that because people stop asking difficult questions after they left the ballot box.
Yeah, right? There's definitely a phenomenon where presidents, I I think anyone in power tends to want power to be where they are. Like if FDR, who we kicked off this conversation with, FDR ran against Hoover as a states' rights, limited government Democrat, which is hard to believe. But the campaign that he mounted to ascend to the presidency was Hoover is too active of a president. We need to have a fiscally prudent states' rights Democrat come into office. And then he gets into office and goes, you know what? Actually, I quite like all this power. I don't know whether he actually meant that in the campaign and was and then changed his mind, or whether he was lying. But either way, once he got there, the power was good, and he didn't want to get rid of that. And you very rarely see people voluntarily give power away. I mean, you can go back to
there are some good examples, and we're actually probably going to do a video about this in the next month. And it's going to be titled something to the effect of "Jimmy Carter is a libertarian hero."
Well, you know what? He did a lot of deregulation, and I'll pause you on that because I want to bring you back on to discuss that specifically. So a couple of questions before we finish up. Regarding Trump, could he be a kind of chemotherapy for the presidency, and that he has been so personally distasteful, maybe he'll take a little bit of the shine off? Or is this just a speed bump along the way to having a priest king?
I mean, I haven't seen any evidence of that among the Democratic contenders. All of them are still talking the same messianic language. But there is a weird feature of the Trump presidency that I didn't have really a means of talking about in the documentary. Let me just talk about very briefly, which is in his bluster and his public presentation and in the grand kind of news cycle dominating theatrics, Trump is very much a piece of what we've been seeing for the last 100 years. Mm-hmm. But in terms of his use of the formal powers of the presidency, Trump is actually the least active president since pre-LBJ.
Really?
And if you look at executive orders and also just kind of a lot of the other sneakier ways that presidents have used power, mm-hmm. Trump has actually been relatively passive. And so there's this weird way in which the presidency under Trump has kind of morphed yet again into a purely rhetorical office, where it's mostly, it is the theatrics, it's the entertainment, it's the tweets, it's the way that you can't go more than 4 hours without thinking about this guy. But as far as actually using the powers of the office, Trump is either incapable of doing it or not particularly interested in doing it. That doesn't mean the office isn't extraordinarily powerful. It absolutely is. But he's not as it's a little bit frightening to think of what someone with his kind of news cycle dominating abilities, but also genuine interest in enacting concrete policy, what someone like that could be able to accomplish.
If we had a Trump that actually wanted to govern, it could be very, very terrifying. Yeah.
Right.
Rob, I've enjoyed talking to you. One more time, if you want to plug the website to check out the video, and I'll throw it. I enjoyed it, and it's well written, and it's reasonably quick too to get kind of this overview of the engorging presidency.
It's a reality show, president.com. People can go directly to that, or they can check out my website at robmontz.com. Andrew, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, sir. Tad bit of listener feedback before we conclude today. Abe Passetti says, I've had more exposure to differing points of view than ever before since I started listening to This Political Orphanage. Andrew has some neat conversations about a range of topics. It's always fair and thought-provoking. You have wisdom beyond your years, my friend. Also, the show is very funny. Thank you. I accept all of that with a very gracious enthusiasm. What a kind thing to say. I appreciate that very much. Remember, you can always tweet me at Mighty Heaton, or you can Facebook me at facebook.com/MightyHeaton, or even email me by subscribing to my newsletter at mightyheaton.com and just replying when I send it out on Fridays. I did last Friday, and I'll tell you, I'm probably better at responding to the emails than I am at Facebook. There's like 8 different channels on Facebook, and sometimes I'll find out someone sent me a message like 3 months ago. I didn't even know it was there. Subscribe to the newsletter. You're more likely to get in touch with me if you'd like to. I'd also like to encourage you to subscribe to Blaze TV and download the Blaze TV app. If you do, you can watch me instead of just listening to me. Use the promo code Heaton to get $10 off your annual Blaze TV subscription. I'm told I look like Albert Mason from Red Dead Redemption 2. I have no idea what that is, but I'm sure he's a very handsome fellow. So download the Blaze TV app on iTunes or Google Play. Get subscribed to The Blaze and then fall in love with me more than you already are. You can also watch portions of the show on Facebook Watch by going to facebook.com/HeatonTV. Finally, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. That helps other people discover this political orphanage that our friend alluded to earlier. Thank you and good day.